We are officially less than 2 weeks away from The Power of the Doctor, which means we are less than 2 weeks away until Russell T Davies is not just the showrunner in waiting, but is the current showrunner, because Chris Chibnall, Jodie Whittaker, they'll be stepping down at the end of The Power of the Doctor. We do not yet know whether or not they will regenerate into David Tennant or Ncuti Gatwa. That remains to be seen. Time will tell. It always does. But we have had a couple of teasers, a couple of little hints from the man himself, Russell T Davies, about the sensibilities of not just Series 14, but even Series 15. So in this conversation, which you can view on the BBC Academy website, he had a conversation with the BBC's Chief Content Officer, Charlotte Moore, about what the BBC and media and television, film, TV in general, can do to inform, educate, and also talk about topics such as climate change, which is an existential threat to the future of humanity. I think that's kind of beyond reasonable doubt now. And there's this really interesting 20-minute conversation that Russ T Davies has with Charlotte on this website, and I wanted to play a couple of clips from it, not just because of fun, oh, here's some Series 15 stuff and Series 14 stuff that might be happening in the future, but also just Russell T Davies reflecting on his output, not just in recent years with stuff like Years and Years, where Years and Years takes place in a dystopian near-future England, and one aspect of that is climate refugees, because that's one impending reality of the climate crisis, as millions of people are displaced because of flooding, or crops go bad so they don't have anything to eat, and the scorched earth basically, so they have to move elsewhere. Climate refugees are basically a near certainty over the next 40 to 50 years of humanity, and it's something we're going to have to deal with, and that's something that happened in Years and Years, where people whose houses were flooded have to move in the protagonist and the main character's houses in one of the episodes. But also when it comes to depicting an optimistic future in Series 1 of Doctor Who, it's specifically in The End of the World. Let's play a quick clip from this chat.
And trying to face this huge monolithic subject. It's very interesting to leap onto Doctor Who's bound to crop up in this conversation. When I started Doctor Who in 2000, when I was writing in 2004, I was very worried that children, that young audience was always being told about death and destruction. There's actually a speech in episode 2 where Christopher Eccleston arrives on a planet and sort of says, the human race, you're always worried that the weather's going to kill you, or eggs, or beef, or viruses. And the point of the speech is, you survive. He says, actually, you survive, because I wanted to do something that didn't have children walking to school thinking, oh my God, we're going to die. And did have them thinking, oh my God, we're going to survive. It's very interesting coming to Doctor Who now in 2022, where you sort of think, actually, and again, I want to provide optimism for that audience, and I mean particularly like a 6-year-old watching it, I want to provide optimism, I want to provide hope. But that speech seems a little hopelessly naive now. I think you have to be more detailed now. You have to be a bit more honest. I don't think I get away with that speech now. Now, actually, what I mean is, I think now the young audience would react to think, oh, that's stupid. You've got to talk about this. You've got to say we're going to flood. You've got to say the temperature's going up, or you're letting us down hugely. So it feels like in 2005, I was very much trying to care for the audience and look after them. Now in a position of thinking I have to listen to that audience, because those young viewers are active. They're engaged with this. They're passionate. It's their world. We'll be dead and gone. It is their world. And they're much more engaged. Yeah.
They would almost be remiss if it wasn't part of any present story, is actually what you're saying, isn't it?
That's what I'm trying to say. Yes. At the same time, but it's a fascinating territory, because it's also one of the problems that we live in an age of, certainly in the West, of vast fantasy culture. It's the Lord of the Rings. It's Game of Thrones. It's Star Wars, Star Trek. It's everything. And I think in some ways we've channeled, this is a theory I'm kind of working up at the moment, we've channeled all our fear and paranoia and our dread about what's to come into our fantasy dramas. The apocalyptic future is an absolutely bog standard setting in science fiction films, and we've almost created that to such an extent that that's our conscience. It's gone into fantasy pieces. It's, yes, if I opened a drama with the Statue of Liberty toppled in a swamp, no one would be surprised. You would go, oh, that's amazing. Everyone would go, oh yeah, that's really bog standard science fiction now. And I think in some ways we are channeling our anxiety into the fiction and not applying enough of that anxiety to the fact.
So that's a really interesting snippet, in my opinion, about how Rusty Davies approached Series 1 and his original run of Doctor Who compared to what he's doing with stuff like Years and Years and It's a Sin and the upcoming tenure of Doctor Who. Because I even pointed this out in my review of Rose from The Trip of a Lifetime, when you can almost imagine the beginning of Rose, where you've just got the blonde bombshell who goes into the basement and, she's killed off like at the beginning of a slasher film. But then the Ninth Doctor turns up, grabs her hand, says run, and the programme announces, no, it ain't that kind of show. And I think that was a good way to imbue optimism and hope into a younger audience who watched Rose for the first time at an impressionable age back in 2005. But I think also taking that approach in certain political strands was completely understandable in the mid-2000s. It is basically a neoliberal position, but it was also the mainstream position as well, where we're in a position where we do have hope, where we can survive the impending crisis, where we don't think it's as bad as it actually turns out to be. And when it comes to climate change, that was a mainstream and understandable position. Let's not forget that companies like BP were well aware of the damage that they were doing to the climate and global warming, now just generally called climate change, but global warming was what it was called in the early to mid 2000s. They knew of the damage that they were doing decades and decades ago, but they deliberately hid and withheld and suppressed the information because they wanted to keep on making money. They did not want to change their behavior at the expense of the planet. As far as I'm concerned, those people have committed egregious, reprehensible crimes against humanity. But that was what people thought in the mid to early 2000s, that it is a neoliberal position and a neoliberal framework, New Labour, Tony Blair, Aliens of London, World War III, etc., unlimited rice pudding. And I think that time of naivete has culturally been and gone. And I think Russell is completely right to acknowledge that. He does say later on, and we'll play the clip shortly, that you don't want to make it all about you don't want to make that the entirety of your output. Absolutely. And that the show is primarily about having fun with boring science fiction adventures. But I also think that not dealing with that in the science fiction show and using the platform as well is not an incredibly responsible thing to do with the massive position and the massive cultural cachet and the audience of something like Doctor Who. I think when it comes to tackling subjects like climate change, you have to not bow to a conservative narrative where it's too political because you're talking about climate change. I actually think that Praxeus was a really great happy medium between the preachy aspect of, let's say, Orphan 55, and something like The End of the World, where you're maybe being, you're kind of ignoring it a little bit, but you are being a bit more optimistic. Praxeus was like about microplastics, which it became like a horror aspect, a subtext to that story. I think Praxeus is something that you could have ripped straight out of the early 70s from the John Pertwee era, something like The Green Death. I think Praxeus fits right at home there. Also, when it comes to like Orphan 55, I don't like Orphan 55, but I also take issue with people saying that Orphan 55 is preachy and therefore bad. You know what else is preachy? The Twilight Zone is preachy. You literally have the narrator, like, it's beginning and end every episode by declaring what the moral of the story is, and that's sort of considered to be some of the best, most influential TV of the 20th century. Preachy in and of itself is not an issue. I just think that the preachiness of Orphan 55, it kind of bowed to a conservative, bordering on like neoliberal framework of individual responsibility. That climate change is coming, but we can stop it with individual actions. Whereas we know, basically, it was interesting that Orphan 55 came out at the time that it did. It came out before the pandemic. And then once everything shut down and lockdowns, and people weren't going outside and people weren't driving cars as much, things didn't shift that much in terms of the climate because the companies were still rolling along. 70% of carbon emissions are done by just 100 companies. It turns out that individual actions from the general public is not going to shift the needle on climate change. It is going to be systemic top-down action. Going down to an individual responsibility is not the answer, and it is leaning into conservative framing. And I think that trying to tell those stories, something like Orphan 55, ironically does have like a conservative framework even though conservatives hate the current run of Doctor Who because it's got more minorities and women involved, it just kind of proves that they can't be happy with anything. It is, in a sense, it is coddling them by saying, no, it's okay, it's okay, everything will be okay as long as we just acknowledge the issue and we take individual responsibility for it. It's kind of like why you see reactionaries get absolutely furious about things like Rings of Power, or House of Dragon when there's black people in their fantasy, because they hate black people and they don't want that in their fantasy dramas or anything. It is coddling them if you just do not acknowledge people of other races or other minority groups and stuff like that. You do not want to be coddling an audience, even though they say, oh, we want to be challenged by sci-fi, we want to be challenged by media, but actually what they want in reality is to be coddled. But when it comes to the future of Doctor Who, the Russell T Davies 2 era, and Series 14 and Series 15, Russell has a little bit more to say, and I think this is also really interesting.
Can you tell us, and I know we mustn't give anything away because it's all too exciting, but will climate themes, will they be in there somewhere? And how much will it be for you about trying to bring that hope in the way you talked about Christopher Eccleston, I guess?
Yes. It's hard. It's genuinely hard because the Doctor's such a genius. It's an inbuilt problem with the show. He's such a genius. You think, well, why don't we step up the TARDIS and fix this problem then? And then you have to take a deep breath where he makes a moral speech saying, well, it's up to the human race to solve that problem, which is a very true speech. It's also a dodge. So it's very difficult. It's like, it's he can't, why doesn't he walk out that TARDIS and cure cancer? Why doesn't he fix the ozone? It's a tricky one. And you've also got to take a deep breath and say, that's not what we're here for. We're here to have an enormous rattling adventure for 50 minutes to have fun and make an audience very happy. And that's a very, very, very important thing. But there are stories. There are stories on the way that are specifically looking at stuff like that. Not all the time, but it has to become part of the atmosphere of the whole show. It has to be, because it's true. It's the world we're living in now. And I'm much more interested in trying to look at, I think very much looking forward to season 2, actually, which is how we ignore these things.
So he says we're talking about Series 2 now, how you ignore those things. So reading between the lines here, it would seem that Russell T Davies 2, Series 2, aka Series 15, is going to be dealing with climate change, possibly climate denialism, which I think is really interesting. Not only do we have Series 15 scripts or ideas and concepts already out there, tangibly in the ether, like that, I could hypothetically break into Bad Wolf Studios and actually find a Series 15 script, or at least Series 15 notes, something on paper. I'm not advocating that, obviously, but I could. It exists. It's real. It's like at the end of the Army of Ghosts. It exists. It's real. The Void Ship's real. So I think that's just a really interesting nugget of information. But what he says is that he can't write for a world that is 15 years behind. He has to write for the world that exists now. He doesn't explicitly mention casting and stuff like that, but I personally think that also has to do with casting. You write for the audience that you have and for the world that you are currently in. That also includes hiring people of different backgrounds, people of different skin color, people with disabilities, people of varying genders, etc. But also when it comes to the reality of the socio-political world that you're in. A lot of Series 10, I think, was kind of also written partly in a response to Trump. There are a few references to Donald Trump in Series 10 about Brexit, which is basically Empress of Mars, things like that. You write what you know. And if you live in a world, if you live in a society, you write based on that society that you currently live in. And that society right now is predominantly very progressive, though we don't vote that way, annoyingly, because we can't get a coalition built. But the majority of people, all polling shows that, we do want to combat climate change. The vast majority of us do believe in climate change and do want to stop the impending extinction level event of humanity that's going to be taking place in the next 50 to 100 years' time. That cliff edge is coming pretty fast. Cybermat strikes, where's the Trump reference in Series 10? Here we go. Doctor Who script search engine. Doctor Whogle is very, very helpful. Here we go. Search Trump. Mythmakers. Donald Trump was first mentioned in the 1960s. Here we go. The Doctor falls. Cybermen, they always get started. They happen everywhere. There's people. Mondas, Telos, Earth, Planet 14, Marinus like sewage and smartphones, and Donald Trump. Some things are just inevitable. So yeah, Hujib, you've already got the quote, Hujib. Very nice. Very good. You're right based on the society that you're currently in. And I think to ignore the world that you are currently in is not just sort of like a dereliction of duty as a writer to tell stories, whether like those stories can be to inform, educate, and to entertain, and everything in between. One thing that sets great writers apart from just being good writers is that having your finger on the pulse of what an audience wants. You know, and I think Russ T. Davies is incredibly clued in. There's a lot of stuff that happened in years and years that, you know, has actually come to pass quite recently. You know, the guy clearly pays a lot of attention to the world around him, and I think his work and his output is so much better for it. Even accidental comparisons, like It's a Sin, was filmed way before lockdown. However, the idea of people with HIV, with this disease, are locked away and isolated from their families, and they're unable to like leave their houses. Obviously unintentional, but it just kind of shows how there is a natural poetry in these narratives that we find in that repeat themselves. And I think that's very interesting that you can find those commonalities between a HIV, AIDS, LGBT drama set in the 1980s, and then it's broadcast in 2021, and we're seeing all of these patterns. We're seeing all these moments that rhyme with reality from 2021. Alex Compare said years and years was scarily accurate of how he predicted some of this. Yeah, it's true. I won't play the clip because I will get content ID claimed, but this Climate Creatives chat with Charlotte Moore does start with a clip from years and years with these climate refugees. There's Jessica Hines' character there bringing in somebody whose bathroom was flooded, and in this chat Russ T. Davies brings up, like, if you told me a couple of years ago that the 2/3 of the country, Pakistan, would be underwater, you wouldn't have believed it. But that is currently happening. You have droughts in one part of the world, and because, you know, the Earth is a closed ecosystem, massive simplification, the water's got to go somewhere, and it was Pakistan. 2/3 of that country is underwater, or it was underwater a few weeks ago. I don't know what the current situation is. Shame on me for not being clued up on current world events, but I can tell you everything about the Daleks and Doctor Who. That's where my life priorities went, apparently. Not saying that we weren't seeing any consequences for global warming, climate change in 2005, 2006. We obviously were, but it was still kind of far enough away, and the effects were minor or negligible enough in certain regions of the world that it could be seen as this far-off sci-fi concept. But now, in the world that Russ T. Davies is writing a new era of Doctor Who in, it is no longer science fiction, it is science fact, it is our scientific reality. It is the reality of the world that a not insignificant portion of the world's population want to completely ignore. There's a reason, you know, very rich people are spending a lot of their money on massive climate doomsday bunkers because they just want to sort of ride out the storm. You know, God forbid the rest of us try and survive this thing. But it's also something that is not really going to be an issue for me. It is not going to be an issue for Russell, because we live in the United Kingdom, and we were also born in a time where it will likely be our children, our grandchildren's problem. It's a tough world to live in, and it's also a tough world to write in. When you are writing science fiction, and like I even talked about this on stream last week about that Doctor Who Unbound story, where it was like, oh, what if this version of capitalism was really evil and it put people down and it just made everybody miserable and it killed everybody? And it's like, oh, you're just describing modern day capitalism. You know, it's getting to the stage where our reality is getting increasingly difficult to satirize. It's getting increasingly difficult to come up with analogies that are worse than what we currently are living through. I'd also be really interested in knowing who the writers are that are going to be joining Russell in these stories as well. Some people say who was it? Was it Orphan 50? Who wrote Orphan 55? It was Ed Heim, wasn't it? And also It Takes You Away. He was somebody who I think could be fun writing for Russ T. Davies too. People would say Pete Matigue, but I don't really know if I would want Pete Matigue under Russell T Davies. I think politically and ideologically they might not get on too well. Let's not forget that Pete Matigue reimagined Melanie Bush as a Dragon's Den capitalist reality TV show host, which is a valid interpretation, I guess, but it is, once again, living within that neoliberal framework that seems quite antiquated now and mainly sort of exists in media to coddle conservatives. It's not something that I particularly resonate with, and I also think it's not something that a big portion of the, not only just the general population, but definitely not the new generation, Generation Z, the TikTok generation, who are very progressive, or at least enjoy the aesthetics of progressivism. It's not something that I think that they would particularly resonate with. People talking in the chat about Maxine Alderton, I absolutely hope that she had maybe some sort of meetings or a chat with Russell T Davies about joining the upcoming writing team, but as an audience, we don't really know what she's got, because she did Village of the Angels. We don't know what her contributions were to Village of the Angels or to The Haunting of Villa Diodati. Well, for Village of the Angels, though, I think that was a really interesting evolution of the Angels, though. It does show what that additional subtext and additional meaning can be brought to an established villain with a different framework. Like, I think it's really interesting how, with the name drop of Belson during the Second World War, that Jericho, he's one of the soldiers who liberated one of the Nazi death camps, and that sort of shows that reframes the Weeping Angels as like a form of encroaching fascism, and I thought that was a really interesting metaphor for the Weeping Angels, that they are something that can literally regress you, that can regress a society if you don't pay attention, that if you blink, if you close your eyes and look away from the evil for even a moment, you can be regressed back in time. And I thought that was a really fascinating way to take the Weeping Angels moving forward. It's something I really hope that they maybe expand upon. As one composer, you are observed and that's my power over you. Yeah, and I think framing that as through the Second World War as fascism, yeah, it was fascinating. It's probably one of my favourite parts of Flux overall. I thought it gave the Weeping Angels a brand new lease on life. Theo, what are your thoughts on the encroaching climate disaster and also on the encroaching fascism of the Weeping Angels in Village of the Angels, written by Maxine Alderton and Chris Chibnall?